webinar on such. Hello everyone, my name's Angela Karp. I'm the Director of Rothamsted Research in the UK. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this webinar on such an important topic of soil science, climate change and agriculture. This afternoon we're going to be covering questions such as what is the potential for soil carbon sequestration, what are the challenges, how can soil science solve the climate crisis and mitigate some of the impacts, and what are the priorities for research and innovation, to mention just a few. Now, as a BBSRC strategically supported institute, these are all highly relevant to our own research and innovation, which is focused on activities of sustainable soils and agri-systems. But today we've got a really excellent panel of speakers who are going to share some great perspectives. Before I introduce them though, I want to give it just a little bit of context of the webinar itself. So this webinar is supported by BBSRC, the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council. BBSRC is one of 9 research councils that forms UK Research and Innovation, or UKRI. And you may have seen from some of the slides at the beginning that UKRI invests $7 billion a year into convening, catalyzing, supporting and investing with others to build a research and innovation ecosystem and system that connects all the way from discovery to prosperity and public good. In this important year and run up to the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, which is being held here in the UK in November, UKRI is taking seriously its role as a steward of research and innovation to bring communities together to debate, discuss and identify solutions that will enable us to tackle climate change and here in the UK to reach our net zero goal by 2050. Please do look up the UKRI website. You can find it on ukri.org/climate if you'd like to know more details of the other activities that they're involved in, and indeed some of the research priorities that they're funding. This particular webinar has attracted a very large audience of people. We're very pleased about that. And of course, it does reflect the importance of this topic. However, it's clearly not going to be possible for us to cover all the Q&As in the time we've got available. However, there is a Mentimeter that you can also take part in. So I've been asked to just bring your attention to that. You can see it on the website and indeed on the webinar opening pages. And if you click on that, which you can do on the same device you're watching the webinar on or on a separate device, you can also share some of your views through that means. And we'll be collecting some of that in the background. It might be used as a help to provide some context to the Q&A. So as I said, we've got a really excellent panel of speakers today. And each of those is going to start by giving a 10-minute talk. And we're first going to have 3 speakers in the theme of challenges. The first is Ronald Vargas, who's the Secretary of the Global Soil Partnership and a soil scientist with over 20 years experience in sustainable soil management. The second in that theme of challenges is Professor Gideon Henderson, who's currently the Chief Scientific Advisor for the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And he's also Professor of Earth Sciences at the University of Oxford. And his expertise covers geochemical processes relating to carbon cycling, climate change, oceans. The third speaker in the first theme is Professor Diana Wall, a distinguished professor in soil microbiology, I can't speak sometimes, and invertebrate diversity at the Department of Biology at Colorado State University. So 3 speakers who will be sharing perspectives about challenges. After they've given their presentations, we will have 20 minutes for the Q&A. And I'll be trying to scan to see which questions we can engage with the speakers in. Now, following that discussion and question and answer session, there'll then be 3 speakers who will focus more on solutions. The first of those is Professor Chris Collins, who's Chair of Environmental Chemistry at the University of Reading in the UK. And his expertise is more on environmental pollution and sustainable soil management. Following him, we have Jonathan Scurlock, who leads on analysis and advice about energy and climate change for the UK National Farmers Union. And his background expertise covers topics such as energy, climate policy, plant physiology, bioenergy, and renewables. And then our last speaker of the session, the second session on solutions, is Professor John Crawford, who's a professor of strategy and technology management at Glasgow University. He's a theoretical biologist with a focus on soil plant microbe systems. Now, obviously, I've given a very brief bite of what are really impressive profiles of all of our speakers. So do look up their full profiles on the webinar website if you'd like to know more about them. Now, I'm going to have the challenging job of trying to summarize the discussions at the end. And I'll do my best. It will be a brave attempt, but it'll be an extremely interesting discussion and debate. I am very much looking forward to it. And I think the best thing I could do right now is get us all going and to ask our first speaker, Ronald Vargas, to get his presentation up so that we can start and the theme 1, which is on challenges. Thank you very much. I look forward to the next time with you in the webinar.
Thank you very much, Professor Karp, for the opportunity. I'm very glad to be here with all of you. So I will move straight into my presentation, and I will just focus on one of the topics, which is soils and climate change. And I will try to see what are the main challenges related to that. Well, let me start by saying that currently all the efforts that we have been doing were to try to show that soils provide ecosystem services that goes beyond only agriculture, because that has been a main focus for a long time. But nowadays, we need to consider and value all these ecosystem services so that the equation for valuing soil is complete. Otherwise, we are missing a great part of this. Topics like soil biodiversity are becoming more and more popular. I'm sure Diana will present this in depth, so I will not go into that, but this is the message we want to give. Carbon sequestration, nutrient cycling, very important, especially when talking about the issue of climate change. And there, clearly, we have a reason why to say that although soils, if not managed properly, can emit also greenhouse gases, but they have the highest terrestrial pool in terms of soil organic carbon. We keep working on trying to have better estimates and measurements, etc. But let's say that currently we do have 694 gigatons of carbon in the first 30 centimeters, and this is with data coming from countries. So it's the latest estimate. That shows us that we have a lot, but we need to be careful, because if we don't manage soils with consciousness of all its, let's say, functional approach, then we can emit all this. But not only CO2, we also need to look at the nitrous oxide, for instance, that sometimes we don't give importance and is fundamental. So soil organic carbon is the basis, is like the fuel of our soils, and they really have a very important role in ensuring stability, aeration, water retention, structure, the productivity, etc. So they are crucial. And that's why we are really focusing a lot on that when talking about climate change, but also about overall soil health. Today, I'm sure many of you have seen that there are many initiatives talking about carbon sequestration, carbon credits. Really, every day there is one new initiative coming up. All are trying to do what there is a call for all industries, the energy sector, etc., to decarbonize the economy. But our answer is to recarbonize our soils. Why? Because they have the largest pool, but also with degradation, we have been losing quite a lot of these stocks. Therefore, we want to bring them back. Is it possible? That's the question. Scientists says, yes, it is possible. And there is quite a lot of science behind, but that comes also with a lot of uncertainty. When talking about agricultural soils, what we are trying to do is to recarbonize them. How? First, we want to see where is the potential to sequester carbon, right? We need many tools in order to support such a process. But the only ones that can make it happen are farmers, because they are the ones managing the soils in reality. Sometimes we are telling them, do this and do that, but they need to agree and they need to see the benefits of such a change. Otherwise, they will not do it. So we are trying to do that. And usually you need to have the tools to measure such gains in carbon. And sometimes they are so a minimum that you need to have these robust methodologies to reflect it, right? So that's why we call the MRV, measuring, reporting, verification. And then we need to understand if we want to go to the carbon market, so to offset emissions, or we just want to enhance soil health in order to contribute all the ecosystem services that I showed you before. But do not forget a big element here. It is not only a matter of carbon, because we need to really pay a lot of attention to nitrogen, because the nitrous oxide emissions can be more dangerous and difficult to sequester or do, and they stay in the atmosphere. So fertilization, nutrient efficiency, etc., that's very important, but we really need to have the same attention to carbon with nitrogen, and that's something it's not happening. But how much can we sequester and where? That is the question. So we have been working with countries, training them on how to understand and do this. And with them, we were able to model if that is possible, and using local data that is not available to the public because countries consider this data strategic, and they are right so. So we have three models of carbon inputs. We have one scenario of sustainable soil management with 5% of carbon inputs, another one with 10%, and another one with 20%. In comparison with business as usual, meaning the management that we are doing now. We were able to generate this map with the 4 scenarios. We launched it yesterday, actually, and this is covering all the agriculture areas of the world. The results are showing us that if we do business as usual, we will be losing our carbon by at yearly minus 0.5%. If we use only 5% addition, there will not be much change. If we do 10% addition, we will have 1.5 plus percentage of soil organic carbon. And if we do the 20% addition, we will have plus 42%. If we talk about how much petagrams, that is, in our best scenario, 0.56 petagrams of carbon per year, which is more or less 2.1 gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year. And this is more or less aligned with many of the papers that are available, right? And here it's important to notice where are, for instance, the 15 top countries with highest potential to sequester carbon. And of course, they are much related to the agriculture sector and big extensions. And here you can see where, of course, there are smaller countries as well that have potential, but because of the extension, maybe they are not visible here. But there you are, you can see where we can invest. If we talk about the emissions from the agriculture sector, and then we really invest on this, we could be able to mitigate around 34% of the agricultural emissions in a yearly basis with soil organic carbon sequestration. That, of course, is quite a lot, but we need to take into account, we are talking about the carbon additions or inputs under the sustainable soil management definition, which looks at the ecosystem services. We could even increase more if we will be trying to reduce the use of fertilizers, to be in the part of the enteric fermentation when talking about livestock, etc. So we can even increase this capacity. And now we are trying to move forward into implementation, because that at the end is the goal. And for instance, we are supporting one country, Mexico, using this map in order to understand where the investment should be done. And it's not only about the potential, you need to see which type of farmers, which crops or value chains should be the ones getting such a support. So this is fundamental, and now countries are working in this regard and setting their targets and ambitions in terms of carbon sequestration. So this is very important. The know-how, I think we know how to do this, because many research institutions like yours have been working for years in trying to identify good practices. And those practices are there and need to be scaled up, not only at pilot level, but we really need to go and try, because the less you can get is that, okay, you will not increase maybe all those amounts that we said, but at least you will maintain the carbon, you will maintain the nutrients, and especially soil health. And I think that doesn't have a financial value, because this is a must. We need to do it. So we are moving from FAO and the Global Soil Partnership into implementation, and we wanted to develop all the tools, and we have them now. We know where is how much, where. We launched also a manual of practices, collecting practices from all over the world, those with scientific results in terms of increasing carbon stocks, but also other ecosystem services. We have the protocol to measure, report, and verify. We have also an extension tool called Soil Doctors for smallholders, because sometimes we are forgetting about them and they can make a difference, and many others. But challenges, if we want to scale up investment, the challenge is that there are many uncertainties, particularly related to additionality and permanence. And overall in agriculture, you know, it's a field with a lot of uncertainty and risks. And in many developing countries, there is no agriculture insurance, etc. So farmers are left alone. They invest and maybe they will not get the return. So we know sequestering carbon is not easy and is full of risks. So we need to talk about the risking opportunities and the risking activities. And that's a field that the economists, all of them manage, but not soil scientists, because we are not really aligned to that. But we need to learn, and we need to get these people helping us how the investments can consider these the risking opportunities. But our task is to really work on those practices that will try to ensure and increase the certainty in terms of additionality and permanence of the carbon. This is the manual I was referring you. We have many practices, and I think it will be useful for people to apply them. Now they are available. And overall, if we are talking about challenges, and I end with this, we have been now talking about topics that were not really addressed before, like the state of knowledge of soil biodiversity, the global assessment of soil pollution, topics that were there, but not really at the political level. Now they are. And when doing any action in terms of soil health, we need to consider all of this. Particularly, we need to really unlock the potential of soil biodiversity, and we need to address the issue of soil pollution, because it's a hidden reality. Nobody wants to address it, but we have to. Because if people are talking about one health approach, including humans, animals, soil health is also there and can have direct input into the air and water quality. So we really reach a moment in which we need to put some specific targets, clear targets, and countries should commit towards, for instance, reducing degradation, enhancing soil productivity, but taking into account the issues I'm telling about health, because they are very important. We need to reduce definitely the greenhouse gas emissions, pollution. We need to try to increase the carbon stocks, enhance the provision of ecosystem services. And of course, we need to make soils a vehicle for trying to generate some economic benefits, especially for those who use it like farmers. All this will contribute to a better society. Otherwise, it's really not only theory, but in practical terms, we will not make it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ronald. Thank you very much indeed. That was an excellent start to this afternoon's panel. I'd now like to invite Professor Gideon Henderson to follow on from that.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you very much, Ron. Given my role as the Chief Scientific Advisor to a government department with responsibility for soils and aspects of climate, I'm going to focus my remarks here with a little bit more of a policy slant than perhaps pure science. And I'm with apologies to those on the call who are from overseas, including some of my fellow panelists, also going to focus in on the UK. And I'm going to try and rattle through 4 aspects where soils have a role in mitigation, and just briefly mention adaptation then at the end. So clearly with a climate focus to my comments. So the first of the areas that I wanted to raise is that of peat. Peat is a big challenge for the UK. It's probably a challenge elsewhere as well, but from a UK perspective, it is emitting about 17 million tons of CO2 to the atmosphere every year through its degradation due to farming. Something like 4% of UK emissions come from this route, and we clearly have to do something to mitigate against this. If we do not only does it put significant carbon into the atmosphere, it also eventually will degrade the peat to the point where it is no longer a rich agricultural soil. Lowland peat in the UK represents some of our most productive farmland. So what we do about that, how we can mitigate the emissions from that farmland without damaging the agricultural sector, is a major challenge. And in broad terms, there are 3 solutions. We either reduce, we change, or we get off. Reducing, we can work out how to grow the crops we already grow more effectively with less peat degradation. Change is to change the crops towards things that can be grown in wetland soils. So the term is paludiculture for crops that grow effectively in that setting, an area where the UK does very little at the moment. Or the third thing is to spare the land, get off it, and enable the peat to be restored so it becomes a sink for carbon rather than a source. And even that last one, although it sounds like it may be beneficial for the environment, also carries risk in the terms of the flood risk that it might lead to if you re-wet substantial areas of peatland. My second challenge is to raise the issue that crops are not only food. There's often a division between agriculture and forestry in the way that we think about our land, and that division is really quite artificial. And increasingly, for carbon sequestration, we need to see an enhanced number of trees in the UK and elsewhere to capture carbon. More trees mean more land, so we need to think about options for sharing and sparing. One way to do that is through agroforestry, so combining crops and either livestock or arable crops, or of course all still food products. Another way that we might use farmland to help with the climate challenges through biomass, thinking about short rotation forestry or short rotation coppicing, or growth of dedicated crops like miscanthus or switchgrass, so that we can generate biomass, displace displace fossil fuels from the system and lead to savings of emissions that way. And these are substantial research challenges. Can we do that effectively without damaging biodiversity? What is the whole life cycle analysis? And it's research that goes beyond natural sciences into thinking about the economic stimulus and the economic model that might make biomass work and align it with farming practices which are also generating sufficient food for our populations. My third challenge, and this will pick up on some of the remarks that Ron already introduced, is around soil carbon, where there is doubtless substantial potential to put more carbon into global soils. And we know some of the ways that we can do that. In the UK, low or zero till or break or cover crops are all extremely beneficial approaches to enhance soil carbon, which has a number of positive attributes. It increases biodiversity, it increases nutrient retention, it makes the soil structure better. It also, of course, improves carbon sequestration. But there are two challenges to that carbon sequestration. The first is on measurement that Ron has already mentioned, the MRV challenge. I won't dwell on that one, but the second one is around permanence, particularly in an actively farmed landscape. The confidence that you have about the permanence of that carbon sequestration is uncertain. And of course, we need the carbon to be locked up for 100 years or more if it's going to really be effective in our battle against climate. So increasing soil carbon is still a really good thing to do. It's still entirely beneficial for the soil. But I do think we need a word of caution here about considering soil carbon offsets as a way to enable polluters to carry on polluting. We get to a situation where we are storing carbon in a potentially impermanent way and enabling industry to carry on through other activity, adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, then we store up big problems for our future. Briefly on soil carbon as well, to mention that often in the UK, livestock on soil is seen as a good way of storing more carbon. It can lead to grassland, which enhances the carbon preservation relative to crops such as wheat. But I think some honesty is needed in that consideration about the fact that grassland may have more carbon than wheat crop land, but forestry has still more carbon locked up into it, and moving land into forestry has a better potential for environmental, for carbon uptake than keeping livestock with their inherent methane emissions on grasslands. I was going to mention also the potential for greenhouse gas removal approaches, which are novel here, things like biochar and enhanced weathering, still very much the research frontier, but I think Jonathan will come on and talk more about those later in our session. So the fourth and the last challenge that I wanted to talk around around mitigation touches again on something that Ron has already talked about, and that is the issue that we mustn't just think about carbon here. We must think about the other greenhouse gases that drive climate change. Nitrous oxide being a good example. And the nitrogen that we add to our soils doesn't only generate that greenhouse gas, it also, of course, pollutes our rivers, and it can lead to air quality issues with impact on human health. So there is a desperate need for soil management to decrease the level of our nutrients that we use in some of our most farmed lands. And similarly, although perhaps less relevant to this conversation, to decrease the pesticides that we use. And I know that other speakers will pick up on the biodiversity aspects of soils, where clearly pesticides are a significant negative to that biodiversity. So there are challenges in that area, challenges where I think science has a great deal to offer, and the wise use of gene editing to develop crops that are more pest or more pest resistant or pathogen resistant, and enable decreased use of fertilizers and enhanced adaptation to climate are really to be welcomed. That's a research frontier, certainly, that the UK is interested in moving more into. So I said I'd speak mostly about mitigation, just a few very brief words about adaptation at the end, so it's not overlooked, especially as DEFRA leads for UK government on adaptation. In the last few months, we've seen publication of the Climate Change Risk Assessment, the third version of that important report, which is a statutory requirement in the UK. And the government is required to respond to the CCRA3 with a national action plan for how we will deal with climate adaptation challenges. Of the 8 priority challenges that are raised in that adaptation report, 3 of them relate to soils. One of them is around the degradation of carbon stores that I've already spoken about. One of them is about soil health and the fact that flooding, drought, and extreme events can damage soil health and lead to soil degradation or compaction. And the third of those primary risks is to do with crops, where there are multiple challenges from climate change which can impact on crops, including heat stress, drought risk, flooding, and moving pests and diseases as we see climate change. So climate change represents a wide range of opportunities to a wide range of challenges in terms of how we need to mitigate against it, and also a wide range of challenges in terms of how we need to adapt for the change that will definitely come. We need to think about both the mitigation and adaptation aspects as we think about the future of soils. Thank you very much.
Excellent again. Thank you very much, Gideon. If I could now ask Diana to pull up her presentation and give the last of the three in this part.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I would just like to move along and tell you what I'm going to talk about here. Part of it is following along Gideon's presentation on the inclusion of soil biodiversity in policy agendas. And then I want to kind of take a step back and look at some history of success that's kind of led us in this direction. What is soil biodiversity? What does it do? Are we losing it? Will it change with climate? Is the rest of this? And so following along on policy agendas right now, we do not see any explicit mention of soil biodiversity. We're hoping that will change, but in the recently released Global Biodiversity Framework, soil biodiversity is not mentioned. And of course, we're looking at, for all of this mentioned, to go with the sustainable goals, development goals that Ronald mentioned earlier. One report that has come out that was also mentioned was about 300 scientists were involved in this. It was published by FAO, and you can see the other sponsors there. This was released in 2020, but in general, what we see is that soil biodiversity is not mentioned in these reports. A lot of this has to do with, I think, history and how we first approached. These were some equations or the factors affecting soils, formation of soils, everything from climate to geology, time. It led to a big experiment in the Great Plains that was from almost the Canadian border of the US down to south to New Mexico and then east, looking at grasslands and agricultural land use change and trying to take those factors that we use to predict a particular property like soil carbon. And they measured this for a number of years to get to a model that's on the right, which is Century. And at the same time, the terrestrial ecosystem model came out. In these models, they had all the factors, they had the data from fields, but organisms were microbes, microbial biomass, and respiration, because that could be quantified. I would like to say that that really kind of set the scene for what is soil biodiversity and soil science in the past. And that continues with more refinement today. For example, there's a paper that was just recently out, large scale, looking at using the Lucas land use sampling across Europe and measuring standardized respiration of microbes and also microbial biomass across land cover types, including agriculture. Now, missing from this again is, what is the question? How do we talk to policymakers? How do we relay what is really in soil? And I think we have to take a step and think about this beyond the ants and the termites, but to all the animals that are in the soil that are considerable, that help make up this 25% of estimated global soil biodiversity. And I think that they are acting in a food web. And so that also has to be taken into account when we think about soil biodiversity is not just being microbes, but it is also a dynamic process of interaction between all these animals and microbes, their interdependence. And there are many now papers starting to talk about the biotic in this first paper, biotic and abiotic controls. These are early synthesis, 2017, a meta-analysis on soil biodiversity impacts. Papers are coming out. I'm sure I've missed some, and I'd like to have some if you want to send them to me. But I think what we're trying to focus on is, because of climate change, this is the only thing that soil biodiversity may do, is help to regulate climate. in these years, we have tried to also take the invertebrates and quantify them. Here are some numbers on nematodes from a global distribution. It basically says that nematodes responded, this is all soil nematodes, respond to the atmosphere is equivalent to about 15% of carbon emissions from fossil fuels, or that it's about 9 gigatons or 60 gigatons, respectively, of soil total carbon emissions. But I want to point out that they do other things, which a lot of people have alluded to. And we know when we think about these, that there are certain animals that are and microbes that are involved in this: cleaning water, the predator-prey relationships of not only fungi, but invertebrates that are running a biocontrol. And we've just barely tapped that. I think the other thing that's of interest to both biodiversity and the framework is the fact that in large numbers of endangered species are dependent on soil biodiversity, the animals in soil, for their food. And what about climate change? Here's an experiment using the same Great Plains. We use the same Great Plains sites, and we looked and at drought rainout shelters, which are used almost worldwide, and looking at the extremes of climate we're going to see. And the study just showed that droughts disrupted the balance between the abundance of root-feeding nematodes, the pathogens, and their predators. In drought situations, the predators in mesic sites, more moist soils, decreased, and the root feeders were released to feed on the plant. We also see that soil-borne pathogens, these are fungi along the left-hand side, and 3 different species or genera of fungi on the right-hand side, and both in experiments, this was about 9 years worth, so it's a temporal scale. Looking, and you see with warming that we see an increase in each of these plant pathogens that are in the soils. We can see where that is and what the predictions are going to be in the right panel. So there is a number of uses for looking at across these soil biodiversity. Not only does it provide multiple benefits that I mentioned, but soil biodiversity seems to be important in all ecosystems. Here is just the societal impact, not only food, but this multifunctionality that can be built into agricultural systems. And here is a new paper just out, and I haven't read it thoroughly, so I just give it to you. But another avenue that's we're going to see more on, I think, in soil science is this bridging of soil biodiversity with medical concerns from everything the World Health Organization has worked for years. The doctors have on soil transmitted elements, on soil transmitted other organisms. And that data and our data and the chance of big data is something that we need to put together to see what we can project for the future. Now, are we losing it? It is less a focus on are we losing an individual invertebrate or microbe. But in overall, this experiment in 2014, an EU experiment with a lot of the UK participants showed that intensive agriculture reduces soil biodiversity, and we see an extinction risk, and there are many other papers. What this points to is the big question: can we restore function? If it's multi-functions that they're doing, a lot of things simultaneously, and we can see from this web of connections, the outside circles are almost every organism in soil, from fungi to invertebrates. And you can see with recent plowing, as you progress 5 to 10 years in a soil, these are grasslands, and you move more into 30 years, the connections are rebuilt and they are stronger in this discussion. So can we protect and conserve when we have focused our management above ground? In other words, does the biodiversity above ground reflect what is below ground? And the answer is no. This paper of Cameron, and again, this is something needing more evidence, but soil biodiversity in the turquoise that is shown here is really high whereas the above ground biodiversity is very low. So the yellow shows very low, but that's what we manage. And given this importance, there has been a volunteer network that's now we're getting some funding for to have a global soil biodiversity observation network. How does soil biodiversity change with climate change, temporal scale, spatial scale? And we're going to look at this in places where policy already exists, and then the non-protected places. There's also the FAO Global Soil Biodiversity Observatory. So what's missing? First of all, soil biodiversity is much more than regulating carbon. We need to include soil biodiversity in policy agendas. We need transdisciplinary research because these soil factors are so complex. So it's more of the biodiversity people and the science, the soil science people meeting together in these crosses and the medical researchers and what's coming down. Then we have to get a definition of what is soil biodiversity for policymakers that's inclusive of all we see. What does it do? Multiple functions, we get multiple benefits from it. Are we losing it? We need these observatories, the spatial scale, going back again to the Great Plains experiment, spatial and temporal scales to be able to answer these. And will it change with climate? Yes, we're seeing a lot of variability.
Thank you.
So then, this is my last slide, and I just wanted to comment on the more than 4,000 scientists that volunteer. This is free. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you indeed. So I'm sure you will agree with me that we've had 3 really interesting talks covering quite a lot of ground there. So let's have a look at the question and answers and see if I can concentrate some of those straight away. So I know that I did have one. Sorry, it's just flicking on my screen at the moment. Oh, sorry, I don't know why it's flicking. Here, I've got it. Do apologize for that. So there is one question, I think, that's for Ronald Vargas. Is there an appropriate mechanization of agriculture that supports sustainable management? That's a very big question, but you've got the challenge of answering it in a quick way. Is there top level?
Well, look, in FAO, we have a division that works on mechanization. So we always have our relations with them and discussions. And yes, they launched a program called Sustainable Mechanization. There is, and I can tell you that they are every time trying to see how they can support all our efforts in order not to disturb and destroy the soils, because that's our main concern in terms of the structure, but also trying to really support farmers. And particularly, they have put a lot of focus in smallholders. So they are making designs so that they can have a small investment, but then some help for their activities with reducing, let's say, greatly the impact of the machinery into the soil structure, the physical properties, but the overall soil health.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm now going to move over to Gideon, because you mentioned about trees, and there is a question about more trees actually equals more water, which of course means less for other environmental people. Have you thought about that, and what's your solution for that?
Broadly speaking, the answer is right tree, right place. And clearly water is an important factor to think about when moving land into increased forestry. And you certainly shouldn't do it, for instance, in peatlands, which would be a stupid place to put trees. You need to do it where there is adequate water for your system, while without damaging other environments. And actually, there's significant advantages if you use trees in the right place for water management. Riparian trees on riverbanks stabilize them. Upland trees stop flooding, flood risk. Planting wetland trees like alders in peatlands could be a way of using them more efficiently. So the idea of using trees to help with our water management rather than to damage it is the way forward, I think.
Thank you very much. I now have a question which I think actually all three of you might want to have a quick stab at. It's an interesting question because it points out that many of the issues that are raised are big challenges. And the question is, should that be better addressed by relatively small, presumably numerous focused projects? Or is this something that really requires bigger, more collaborative projects, some of which of course have already been mentioned by speakers? I wonder whether, Gideon, you'd like to start with that first, then Diana, a quick comment, and then finally Ron.
Yeah, happy to. It's a good question. And you won't be surprised to hear as a scientist that I think both are needed. You need small and big. And you might phrase it in terms of technology readiness level, or you might phrase it on in the nature of the problem. That some things we simply don't know how they will work, and funding a particular group to look into a particular question might be exactly the right thing to do. But with other technologies or other approaches, what we need to do is actually demonstrate them at fairly large scale and see how they operate. And there it's much more efficient to have a large number of groups working in the same demonstration project. And it's always been one of the things I've really liked in the last few years is that in the UKRI space, we've started to see that full breadth of R&D going into thinking about agriculture and food production, which I think is really welcome. Thanks.
Thank you, Gideon. Diana, you mentioned already interdisciplinary teams, so I'm thinking you might be going in that direction, but maybe you have a different answer from what I think.
No, I think the answer is yes. Collaborative projects, field projects, going back to where we have both the morphology and we need the molecular techniques also now. And with soil scientists, it's huge. And I think the only constraint that a lot of researchers have is that it takes so much more administrative management for all these people. And so that would be what I would say. There's not enough funding for that. I would also speak to cross-funding. It's very difficult to get cross-agency, at least in our country, cross-agency funding for a same project to get people to chip in. Hopefully that's going to change, and they will see a collaboration between different types of agencies.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that UKRI is positive for, because we're able to bring together these different research councils that represent different areas of science in many ways. But let me now ask Ron to have a quick stab at that, because you mentioned globally scaling projects. So I would like to hear your perspective briefly, if you would.
Yes, well, that's a very important challenge, because I think we all face the same. In fact, we have divisions. So imagine the name already tells you what we have. But when the challenge, and I think where we can bring all these solutions is on the ground, because when you implement on the ground, you need to, it's not that you can just talk about one topic, soil biodiversity or Karp or anything. No, the response should be integrated, because you need to get the best of all and bring them together. And we cannot separate water, vegetation, and nothing. So that's where we really need to bring our solutions together. But institutionally, really, we need to make the effort that at higher level in every institution, we have big programs that bring on board the different expertise that is available, because otherwise we are all close in our own niche, and then sometimes we lose the perspective. That's why it's very important to not forget who are the end users and where we are going to apply all this. And then the solutions should be really addressing the nature, which is integrated and not disassociated.
So, Ronald, if I could pick up on that, because there is a question which relates to it, I think, which is how do we foster the right kind of behavior from smallholder farmers when a number of government policies still promote practices are about yielding faster and getting more productivity?
Yeah, that is one question. I mean, all have different roles, right? That, like, we in fact work with governments and we try to really advocate for updating the policies and trying to see more the sustainability, because that's fundamental. It should not be only producing more and more and more. We are talking about safety. We are talking now about quality, etc. So sooner or later, there is a lot of pressure politically and with the social channels, etc. There is a lot of pressure for changing. So the UN and many international organizations are trying to do so. I'm sure that sooner or later this will be changing. But in the meantime, of course, smallholders are, as I told you, are left alone, especially in developing countries. The poorer the country, the most alone is the farmers. So alternatively, we really need to aid, especially these big NGOs and international cooperation should try to focus on them, on trying to bring them, let's say, technical support in order to implement all what we are saying, but in practical terms.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to switch a little bit to ecosystem services of soils, which I think has been alluded to by all of you. And actually the challenge which a number are picking up in the questions from what I can see about, okay, how do we measure soil health? And how do we measure that it's changing in the right direction? Is is a good soil biodiversity equal to soil health? Are there other things we talked about? It's not just carbon, it's also nutrients. So where are we going to know that the changes that we're trying to implement are moving things in the right direction? We've heard a lot about tools today, but the question is still being raised about what's a healthy soil. So I wonder who would like to, maybe Diana, if you'd like to start on that, and then there are some more specific questions I might pick up with Gideon.
Yeah, I think that a number of scientists and with stakeholders, with farmers and others, have approached this by looking at indicators, and indicators mean something different. Is it a suite of indicators? Do you pick different organisms? Do you pick different processes, nitrogen cycling or whatever? I think that's one way that has been put forth. I think the FAO has tried, and Ronald can speak to that a little bit more to get that in the picture. But I think overall, what we're measuring is the quality of the food production. Are the lands left for future generations? And thinking about the bigger picture of what are our challenges that are so urgent right now that we've got to come to some agreement, even either across the nation or standardized even more fully. And in this Soil Global Observatory Network I mentioned, that is one of the things that happened, is we came together and we said, we've got to quit this. It's got to be this method of extraction or this method. Here's the standard. We're going to follow it. We've got to get some answers and start seeing about change.
Thank you very much, Diana. Gideon, if I could expand the question a bit, because there is one directly asked of you, which is, how do we feel about transitioning farming towards more agroecological systems that tackle things like nitrogen pollution and the soil crisis, and especially, some of the things like crop rotations that you mentioned already, and shifting from intensive livestock to more integrated, extensive livestock. But if we are going to do that, how do we make sure that there's the right investment in farmer-led agroecological research? You're still on mute, Gideon.
Yeah, thank you. I just realised as you were saying it. So I may be controversial here by saying that I like the phrase sustainable intensification, because I think it represents a challenge both to those with a more scientific bent and those with a more conservation bent. And that is what we need to do. We need to both increase the health of our ecosystems and get more land from our more food from our limited land. So that's the challenge. I think it's one that we can meet. I think science and research has a fundamental role to play in meeting that challenge. And what we should be looking for are systems that increase productivity from our land, measured either in pounds per hectare or measured in calories per hectare, or however you want, so that we can decrease our land use while getting the same or more food from it. There was a second part to your question, though, which was around livestock in particular. And if you look at livestock through the narrow lens of climate, they are clearly bad for climate. They have very substantial emissions to our atmosphere of methane, and their slurry creates nitrous oxide as well. So livestock as a system is something that we probably should be seeking to decrease the land that we use for, and potentially the total amount of livestock from a climate perspective. The idea that keeping livestock on large areas of land is the best way of doing it is not necessarily the case. It's certainly an argument made by some people. But if you look at some countries, and you might look at somewhere like Denmark as an example of this, their carbon emissions per kilo of meat is actually half of ours because they use a more intensive system. And that frees up your space, but by intensification, it frees up your space to nurture and look after your ecosystem and to enhance your biodiversity, perhaps to rewild or to grow more trees for further carbon sequestration. So I don't think it's a simple question whether intensive farming systems are good or bad. There are multiple models. We do need to think about the carbon benefits of which one we pursue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'm going to try and squeeze two in if I can. One very quick final remark from you all, but I've got one more for you, Ron, which is quite a tricky one. And we are in the year of COP26. We've been told that this is make or break year, but the concern is that, you know, some of the government policies are not really aligning with the sorts of things we're talking about today. So there is a question about that. How can we influence some of the policies in, you know, more countries to move in these directions?
Well, definitely there is a lot of expectations for Glasgow this year, and I really hope we will have good news after it, because, like, for instance, all this carbon issue is just all voluntary. There is no regulation, so there are many issues with that and challenges. And something very important is that we have been trying to make an analysis of the recent NDCs, the National Determined Contributions. And for instance, if compared with the previous set, we have seen a substantial increase of countries that are committing and including soils in the National Determined Contributions. And for us, that is already quite a lot of progress, because that means that now all the advocacy, all the work that has been done by research and others is showing some results. So I'm really, let's say, optimistic that this is something that can be accompanied by good decisions in Glasgow, because countries now are more informed and they realize that soils can help them in the fight of climate change, not only mitigation, but also adaptation. So we hope in December we will have good news.
Thank you. We're all hoping. So I have one quick question for you. The answer is yes or no only. Given that there's always the need for more knowledge, can we start implementing? Do we have enough knowledge now that we can start implementing now? I mean, some of you have alluded to that already. Gideon, I start with you first. Yes or no?
Have to start now.
Yeah. Diana?
Yes.
And Ron?
Definitely yes.
There we go. Well, that's a very great way to end. And I'm sorry to those people who have asked questions. They're all in the chat. And, you know, I'm sure that they'll be followed up, if possible, by individuals, if that is possible. But I do think we need to move on, because we need to switch now to start the second theme, which is more about solutions. And I'm very pleased to invite our first speaker, who's going to speak on that topic, Chris Collins from University of Reading. Chris, you might still be on mute.
Can you see my slides okay?
We can indeed, thank you.
Okay, great. So I've been asked to talk specifically about research need, and it might be that I talk and actually touch upon a lot of the topics that have all been raised by the three speakers, and certainly some of the topics that came up in the questions, but hopefully that sort of reiteration will help to embed some of the messages. So most of my learning has come from being the coordinator of the UK Soil Security Programme, which finished about a year or so ago, where we're looking at how soils resist, adapt and recover under land use and climate change. But more recently, I've been developing a new soil strategic programme for UKRI, and we've been discussing that with policy and practitioners as well as researchers. So some of the thinking that's come from that I'll also share with you. So I think, as others have said, it's not just about soil carbon. What we need to also think about is soil degradation in the round. And this is one piece of research from the Environmental Land Degradation Forum, sort of under the UN. And they found that actually 33% of the world's soils were degraded. And that they costed that at 1 trillion or 17% of global GDP. So never mind carbon investments, what happens if you invest in the restoration of degraded soils? So as others have said, it's not just about carbon and climate change. If we restore our soils, we will enhance their biodiversity and also be able to mitigate against climate change. And Ron mentioned these different soil ecosystem services. And I think it's really important. It's not just about carbon sequestration. We get water purification, we get climate regulation, we get nutrient cycling, habitat for organisms that was spoken so well about from Diana. Flood regulation, really important in the UK. The cost of some of our flood incidents recently have gone into the billions. And then what many people forget is a huge source of pharmaceuticals from soils. Up to 40% of modern antibiotics are derived from soil organisms. So just think of the value that comes from that. And with antimicrobial resistance coming, that's probably going to be even greater pressure that we can deliver from that particular source. So we must think about this in a holistic manner. I won't spend too long on this particular slide. It was just really to remind people, but it's already been said by others, that as well as carbon in soils, we also have to think about methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions, and they're influenced by the climate and the management of soils. So we need to think about those more broadly. So Ron gave us some good diagrams about the soil carbon stock, and this just shows where the carbon stock is high is in red, and is in blue, and where the carbon stock is low is in red. So you can see there's some quite large geographical areas where it's low. But I think what I would like to raise is actually the data where we actually have soil profile depth, so we can really look at stock, is actually not that well scattered as we would like. And certainly if we're trying to make proposals to farmers at the field scale, we do not have that sort of resolution that we require. And as Ron said in his talk, there is a lot of security around the release of data into FAO. Well, if we're going to get independent organisations and agricultural advisors to use this information, it's got to be open access. And we do have problems with this in the UK that many of you listening will probably be familiar with. So there was some mention about carbon stocks, and I'm particularly a fan of systematic reviews because they bring the whole set of knowledge together from multiple studies. This is one from Hadaway in 2017, and they did a systematic review of 200 studies, and they looked at the difference between carbon stock in soils and tillage. So this is no-till versus tillage, and you can see at the depth of 0 to 15, most studies suggest that we get an increase in carbon stock. But if we then look at the similar studies, or a subset of these studies, not all 200 did down to further depth, and you can see that actually the increase in carbon stock is not as marked. And actually, if you do that across the whole soil profile, most studies tend to suggest there's not a significant increase in tillage. But what I wouldn't want us to forget, and I think this is the key message that many people have raised, is there's lots of supplementary beneficial outcomes from these management practices. We get reduced erosion, very important. Obviously, we want to maintain our soils. We get increases in biodiversity because you get less turnover and less interference with the soil. Particularly things like earthworms are very much profoundly affected by tillage, and we get increased water retention as we don't sort of disturb the soil profile. So I've been talking across the different actors about what a new soils program might look like. It was very much a science in the field, hard science driven program that we previously had. But what we really need to do is open that out and make it more transdisciplinary. and that was again touched on by others. So we need to involve policymakers and farmers and field operatives, and we need to do the research to understand how these different actors interact, so we can then develop appropriate tools to disseminate the information. And that information can come from environmental Earth observation. I'll give an example shortly, that then integrated by these systems then go download to things like simple soil apps. But we also need to understand the economics, and there's very little good economics around soils, as well as understanding the capacity needs that we have. There's only been one program, for example, in the UK in recent times that's actually sort of focused on soil science and developing PhDs. So another thing that's come through is we have a very urgent need to develop these changes quickly. So for example, the ELMS program, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, that will go across England, is going to be introduced in 2024. And that will now be payment for ecosystem services rather than payment for land area. So we need very quickly to find those activities that work to enhance the ecosystem services from soils. So we're going to have to use what I would consider this action research paradigm, where we have researchers in policy settings and vice versa, but also researchers in practice and vice versa. Because many of these management solutions are relatively untested in the whole suite of different soils and different management systems that we have across England. And across the UK, for example, we have 700 different types of soils. So we've got a really heterogeneous and complex mix that we have to deal with. And I noticed that also was stated about the short funding cycles we have, often 5 years or less. So that this is another way of potentially addressing that. So just some examples then of what the research needs, how they might be addressed. Here's one looking at satellite data and looking very much at the landscape scale. It's based on David Large's work at Nottingham, but there's a lot of interest in this from Natural Resources Wales. So there's that sort of policy research interaction. And they're looking at using satellite data to measure deformations in the peat. So as peat dries out and starts to degrade, we can pick that up with satellite data, and we can do it at scale. So you can see up to 10 kilometer scale here, whereby so we could start to really get a good quantification of peat across a wide area, rather than just going into the field and having a very limited sort of verification from field sampling. But clearly there is a place for field sampling, and we've got to use soil management. Here's an example, sorry, of using soil management to improve water quality. It's some research going on between the university, a doctoral training partnership from UKRI with Affinity Water as partners, and the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust. So we're using these simple spectral meters that a farmer can use, and the output is linked to a mobile phone. It uses the spectra from this simple handheld meter that then goes up to the cloud. It interrogates using AI that spectra and looks at the data bank to say what the carbon content and the total nitrogen or the pH of those soils can be, so we can then manage behaviours and look at different management systems. So if we increase soil carbon, we get improved water filtration, reduced inputs, and that improves water quality downstream and reduces treatment costs. So we're saving financially here. Again, I would say a sort of counter to just investing in carbon sequestration in soils. So my time's up, so I'll just give you my take-home messages. So we need to think about soils as multifunctional, providing many ecosystem services. Think beyond carbon. We need transdisciplinary platforms to address the evidence needs for policy, and funding's needed for the long term. Many soil processes go for tens of years, as many of you are aware, but action research and space for time may help us to address that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. I say picking up, but moving on from some of the discussions that we had. I'd now like to invite Jonathan Scurlock to follow that, actually coming in with a policy perspective, I'm sure. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Angela, for the intro. Thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm going to say something about, oh, sorry, am I screen sharing or is UKRI showing the slides?
No, we can see NFU achieving net zero on the
Yeah,
screen.
yeah, no, okay, well, I'll just shout next slide when I need it then. So yes, I'm not a soil science expert, although I know a lot of people who are. I've been working right way across energy and environment policy with the National Farmers Union for the last 15 years, but I do have some background in soil science modeling, including with some of Diana's colleagues at Colorado State University. So I'm going to talk about soil science and policy needs for net zero, starting off with this, which was 2 years ago, our declaration of intent, considerable raising of our level of ambition. We believed, as we published this report, that agriculture can indeed actually counterbalance its greenhouse gas emissions and achieve net zero. And we were one of the very first sectors in the UK to actually make that declaration, round about the same time as the UK government itself took the advice of its independent climate change committee and then brought in legislation to commit future governments to achieving net zero by 2050. So for our sector, this strategy, which was a 12-page document, laid out the challenge, looked at the role of UK agriculture in the current UK emissions inventory. We're about 10% of the total. And then essentially pitching what is unique about agriculture. The fact that we are one of the few sectors that does have the potential to actively remove at least carbon emissions among greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere to counterbalance our residual and unavoidable emissions from food and other forms of agricultural production. And then the report lays out a bit about the approach and how we have to work in partnership clearly with many other stakeholders. And lastly, 1 or 2 points I want to come back to about measurement, reporting and verification. So next slide, please. So there's the plan. On the left, we're looking at agricultural emissions in the official UK inventory for 2017. Only 1/10 of that is carbon dioxide. About half of it is methane, mostly from ruminant livestock, and the balance is nitrous oxide from labile nitrogen in the soil and denitrifying bacteria. We've got to counterbalance that, and the first thing that we can do, and this is a 3-pillar approach, we make productivity improvements, a whole range of things, ranging from animal and plant health through to taking up new technologies, managing our inputs more efficiently, getting more bang for our buck effectively, so that we can reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of UK food and other agricultural products progressively. But clearly, we're not going to be able to reduce them to zero. We can stretch ourselves perhaps and say, well, if we really push hard over the next 20 years, we should be able to bring that down by about 1/4. We then have to offset or counterbalance the remainder. Firstly, with so-called nature-based solutions, which is various forms of farmland carbon storage in vegetation and soils. And then you'll see the large part of there is a further round of greenhouse gas removals from so-called engineered greenhouse gas removal technologies, things that are a little bit more technological than simply trying to manipulate or enhance nature. Next slide, please. So there's that plan laid out. As you can see, there's quite a wide variety of different measures under each of those headings, so-called Pillar 1, Pillar 2, and Pillar 3. Some headline numbers that represent at least our first cut estimates of how we believe we can achieve this goal. Now, what I want to focus on right now, following on a little bit from what Gideon was saying earlier, and actually I think also picking up on some of those points that Chris was making. So under Pillar 2, nature-based solutions, along with enhancing vegetation, measures that we can, changes in farm practices that are likely to boost soil organic matter, whether it's changes in tillage practice, whether it's changes in soil amendments, but building soil organic matter where available to maximize the equilibrium potential of organic matter in the soil at depth if possible. Interestingly, though, and picking up on something Gideon referenced earlier, under Pillar 3, there are further opportunities to make interventions in the soil, but not necessarily around soil organic matter, at least not directly. Probably things that would interact with soil organic matter, but so-called novel soil amendments. So things like inorganic carbon, biochar, essentially powdered charcoal, as a soil amendment, That is a way of putting carbon really long-term into the soil, perhaps in a way which is less vulnerable to disruption by further climate change than the equilibrium level of soil organic matter itself. And then other new technologies which are being explored, such as the impact of spreading certain accelerated weathering minerals, enhanced rock weathering, another term used for this, things that will react with carbon dioxide in the interstitial air spaces in the soil, turn it into carbonates, and then we have to be able to track where those carbonates go. But certainly if they remain stable, then it is yet another form of intervention on the land, accessible to farmers, which certainly interests us greatly in terms of achieving this balance. Next slide. So here's a picture that I took at the NIAB, National Institute of Agricultural Botany, soil pit at the Agricultural Cereals Show earlier this summer. And the card on the soil there says, look, take a good look at this. Soil organic matter levels diminish with depth. The really active layer is that bit just in the immediate rooting zone. And anything beyond that is, yes, there's some deep rooting, there is some translocation and leaching and so on taking place. But we do need to be careful about not making sweeping assumptions that we can universally improve soil organic matter right the way down at depth. We also have to be clear that these opportunities are not evenly distributed around the country. Some farm types, some types of agricultural operation have an opportunity to enhance their soil organic matter through modest, perhaps common sense changes to farm practice. Others may well be sitting on rather large carbon stocks, but have very limited opportunities to enhance them further. And the people with the big carbon stocks are going, hang on a minute, why can't we get paid too, as well as those guys down there who are expecting some kind of reward for providing a public service of capturing more carbon out of the atmosphere? So we must address this geographical imbalance. We need to address the distribution of soil organic matter and its opportunities to build within the soil depth, going down through the soil horizons. And we do have to be a little bit careful here not to exaggerate the opportunities and say, oh yes, nature-based solutions are going to be able to totally counterbalance all of our residual fossil fuel emissions. I think as Gideon or somebody was saying earlier, that's clearly not the right approach, especially if we've got concerns about additionality and permanence. We've really got to bring down greenhouse gas emissions in the first place and only use these greenhouse gas removal technologies and techniques as a way of counterbalancing the absolutely unavoidable residuals. So next slide, please. And here is at least one example of these unconventional soil amendments and a little outline of both of them. These are both still off in the future. There is relatively little commercial practice of this. This is all largely in the science community at the moment. That picture there from the University of Illinois earlier work, they're looking at enhanced mineral weathering under 3 different crop types there. That's been going on for a number of years there and now, and we're expecting soon to have some of the science results about where does that fixed carbon go from the land spreading of basaltic iron magnesium silicate rocks. Just starting under UKRI, thank you very much, some field trials now in the UK led by the University of Sheffield, and we're sitting on the advisory group for that, as well as other work which will be doing field trials on biochar as well. And we look forward to being able to report on actual field work, actual engagement with farmers who can now start to see the sense in this, and hopefully pretty soon opportunities to turn this into real policy measures which can then be rolled out nationwide. So it's not all about soil organic matter. There are also these rather more sort of technological engineered ways in which we could be using land spreading and activity by farmers to capture more carbon in our land. Next slide. And very grateful to Pete Smith up at Aberdeen for this. This was a slide that he showed from a paper which is cited there at the bottom, recent paper in Global Change Biology, talking about the complexity of monitoring, reporting and verification of enhancing soil organic carbon, or indeed any other kind of way of fixing carbon in the soil. It's got to be multi-scale and multi-level. You need to be using remote sensing data as well as so-called ground truth physical measurements on field plots, and then perhaps interpolating a little bit in between them using things like eddy covariance, measuring the actual carbon flux into the biosphere from the atmosphere at local level, and ultimately using all of this to populate models. Because in the end, if we're going to be rolling this out at national level and turning this into government policy to encourage farmers to fix more carbon in the soil, it needs to be credible, the monitoring and the reporting and the verification of this. It's going to require models, and ultimately I think those models are going to have to demonstrate correlations between things that we can easily monitor at the farm scale, sort of thing again that Chris was alluding to.
Yeah.
Things that farmers can do, simple measurements, which will provide a proxy indicator of the enhanced opportunities for soil carbon capture.
Can I ask you to...
Last slide,
yeah,
yes.
Thank you.
Last slide, here we are. Those are our policy asks and science asks. So farmers are definitely going to have access to some kind of reward, whether it's coming through the private sector or the public sector, ideally through both, in order to maximize this opportunity. We need these proxy indicators through model predicted carbon storage, proxy indicators of changed farm practice likely to store carbon. And then lastly, please, our regulators do think about the novel technologies which are just coming over the horizon. We must be able to enable the land spreading of these novel carbon fixing soil amendments without having them snarled up in regulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, there's an interesting one to finish on. I'm happy now to invite John Crawford. John, you've got the last 10 minutes to take us through your perspective on challenges. You might still be on mute at the moment, but perhaps
I am still on mute. Sorry
Thank
about
you.
that. Thanks, Angela. So, yeah, the advantage of coming at the end of a session like this is that everybody said all the really cool stuff, and you don't need to work too hard. So thanks to the previous presenters for setting the scene very well and identifying the challenges and opportunities. I just want to refocus our attention back on what I think is the challenge that we've got here, which is global soil degradation, the need to restore the health of our soil at scale and on time because of a number of interconnected challenges that we face globally, which are probably the biggest challenges we've ever faced. We all know, I hope, that this is a critical decade. We've got 10 years left to prevent serious deviation of temperatures from equilibrium that could threaten runaway climate change. This is just a graph of actual emissions up to around 2020, 2019, I think it is, and the projected decline in emissions that are needed in order to keep the temperature below 1.5 degrees. Obviously, the earlier we started reducing emissions, the easier it would have become, but now we're up here, we've got to do some kind of miracle in order to keep temperatures within 1.5 degrees. And that has to be in the next 10 years. There's a lot left to do. This is a couple of charts from the task force for scaling of the voluntary carbon market led by Mark Carney and colleagues, showing how emissions have to reduce in order to meet the legally binding terms of the Paris Agreement. And the minimum level of carbon offsets that are required to help. So even under the most optimistic predictions of what's possible in terms of emissions reduction, we still need about 2 gigatons CO2 equivalent by 2030. And this is the level of offsetting that is currently available. And there's something like a 15 times increase needed even just to meet that minimum requirement by 2030. Now, Ronald's lovely picture of of the opportunity for carbon sequestration in soil. Coincidentally, the total amount of carbon that the soil can sequester under this new country-led estimate, which is probably one of the best estimates that we've currently got, is around 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide CO2 equivalent per year. And I don't think that's a coincidence. The universe is telling us that soil is where we need to look to sequester that carbon. But it's a huge task, right? It's a global task. This is a global problem that needs a global solution. Now, the question is, will that potential be realized? Can we really get 2 gigatons of carbon into soil? And by the way, the real reason for doing that is to restore the health of soil and the functions that we depend on for food, water, and supporting biodiversity. Well, here's a report, a very recent report from the Environmental Defence Fund on that, looking at how farmers might be supported and incentivized to create new practices that they might not already be operating under. The problem is that there are around about, they looked at 12 different MRVs. So these are basically certification schemes and verification schemes that could be used and are being used to deliver credits to farmers. They vary vastly in the measured soil, in the way that they measure soil organic carbon, and result in almost an order of magnitude difference. And their conclusion in this report is that because of the fragmentation of the standards for measuring soil organic carbon, they don't think there's any hope of using soil to sequester carbon. And therefore, one of the best routes to improving soil health might not be part of this opportunity in the carbon market. And that's generally true across the whole spectrum of issues relating to soil. It's hard to implement change at scale and in the time we have left because everything's fragmented. MRV standards are fragmented, farming is fragmented. There's 500 million farmers in the world. Most of those don't belong to cooperates, very difficult to reach. Policy is fragmented. Certification schemes are fragmented. So if we're going to make a difference, if we're going to make an impact, we need to get outside of our silos. That means our disciplinary silos, but also our national silos. This is an international effort and partly motivated by that. Over the last couple of years, I've been focusing on trying to pull together what I think is needed to deliver impact at scale. And I was helped tremendously in this by the support of the sustainability team at PwC, where we interviewed as many organizations as we could talk to try and understand how we could overcome the barriers. First of all, identify the barriers, and then overcome these barriers to delivering impact at scale. And particularly, how to develop solutions that are fair and equitable, because many of these carbon credit schemes are not necessarily in the farmer's best interests. And there's a huge power imbalance between large financial organizations and small farmers that risk huge inequities and therefore loss of trust in the whole system. And so another key point that we wanted to address is how to manage the risk and vulnerabilities that are inherent in trying to get carbon back into soil. So I got together with an old friend who used to be head of financial services at PwC, is now at the University of Sydney. And we put together a scientific committee comprising people who know what they're doing in this field from around the world. And a bunch of corporates who between them have the global reach and governance to connect with between 60 and 90% of the world's farmers. Plus, in addition, corporates that have deep pockets in terms of carbon credits, technology providers that can help accelerate the implementation of technology on the ground, and the finance sector that I believe is going to be one of the biggest levers in getting stuff done on a global scale. We identified a bunch of different challenges and barriers. First of all, the science is highly uncertain. MRV, scalable, affordable MRV is just, it doesn't exist. And the whole question about how to manage permanence in the context of carbon credits has also not been worked out. So the coalition has put together some work streams that will address these issues starting from now, and we hope to make some progress in a short time scale, because these are not 5-year research projects. These are directly linking to impact, and as everybody agreed, we have to start impacting now. So I just wanted to kind of go into a few reflections on my experience from getting involved in this. First of all, as we've said, restoring soil health is about much more than carbon. But let's not neglect carbon because it's an easy win. So let's get started. And at the same time, pull in a whole bunch of other things that need to be done in order to restore soil health. 84% of the world's farmers farm 12% of the land, 16% farm 88% of the land. That means we need very different strategies for smallholders compared with larger scale farmers to meet the needs, to meet the outcomes associated with social, biodiversity and climate benefits. I guess the key reflection for me is nobody knows how to do this. I thought I'd come across a bank or somebody that knew what they were doing, but nobody knows how to do it. And what we're finding is the organizations that I'm working with are coming together because they want to co-create the solutions. And I think that's a key message, probably the one key message from my talk, if you're going to remember anything, that we need to start doing now, and we need to co-create these solutions and get better at it over time. What was I going to say about science? Yeah. And we need a better way of meaningfully connecting science with impact. Farmers have to be at the center of this, because if we don't secure and maintain their trust and give them the incentives to change, nothing will happen. And in my view, we need a very different way of doing research. It should be action-based research, as was said earlier, but I think farmers need to be part of that. I think we don't do any more experiments in the field. We work with farmers. They're working in living laboratories. They're the citizen scientists. The data that they're collected on their farms should help inform the science and deliver impact more quickly.
Thanks, John. Can I ask you to just wind it up now?
Yeah, this is pretty much it.
Thank you.
What I wanted to say to finish up was that all of these barriers that get in the way of getting this stuff done were removed for the COVID. I'm talking about particularly the funding barriers, the ability to get stuff done quickly, policy and environment change. It was all done very quickly in order to address the COVID crisis. It wasn't necessarily done in a very good way internationally in terms of joined up solutions. And if we can't overcome the same barriers to progress for the climate and environment, then in my view, at least, it will be because we don't really believe that it's an emergency.
Thank you. Well, that's a very provocative ending, John, in a year where we're told it's make or break. Okay, let's have a look at the questions that have come in for the speakers. And I think there is a one for you, Chris. Excuse me while I just find my screen stops flickering. Yeah, so economics, that was an interesting comment you made. And the question is about how different would that be about other aspects of, farm level economics or business assessments that people are doing already on their farms?
So I'm not an economist, so I'm feeling I'm on shaky ground answering this a little bit, but maybe John might want to pick this up. I know he's sort of dabbled in that area more than I have. But I think it's about doing the more holistic analysis rather than just looking at yield. So, you do things like natural capital approaches and look at the whole performance of the farm. So I think I'll stop there because otherwise I'll be out of my area of expertise.
Okay, so John, do you want to have a quick answer to that?
So soil health delivers a whole bunch of public and private benefits. which the private sector should be paying for and the public sector should be paying for.
All right. So I'd now like to move to Jonathan, some questions for you in the list here. If we stop producing emissions by burning fossil fuels today, how quickly do you think agriculture could bring us back, in terms of the targets that we have? And they've commented this seems especially relevant to me as we are only at 1 degree C at the moment, and we are already seeing huge problems in agriculture as a result of that.
Well, our ambition is for the UK agricultural sector to counterbalance its emissions and reduce firstly and then counterbalance its emissions within 20 years. I saw some comments in the chat suggesting that perhaps we can go further than that. Perhaps agriculture can go carbon negative overall and may well be able to provide greenhouse gas removal services to other sectors. And that certainly could be the source of some of this private sector finance that we see hovering around on the edges. Clearly, and we're reflecting on 18 months of COVID crisis management. One of the first things we noticed during the COVID crisis, at least in the UK, was that our city air was a lot cleaner, and that people who could never normally hear birds singing because of the roar of traffic could suddenly hear nature. Farmers carried on farming throughout that. People had to eat. We had to carry on trying to maintain food supply chains. There was an interesting message there, really, that suggests that 3/4 of the problem is not outside the agricultural sector. It is the rest of the economy that's really got to bring down carbon dioxide emissions. And then some sectors like agriculture with rather more tricky, intractable biological greenhouse gas emissions must do what they can to at least counterbalance their own emissions. I'm not entirely sure yet that agriculture can take on the responsibility of counterbalancing everybody else's emissions.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, there was an interesting question that I picked up, which is it better, and actually, I guess it could be to the whole panel, but I'll ask it of you. Is it better that soils deliver really well against one objective or have lower level delivery to a broader range of objectives in terms of ecosystem functions?
Yeah, I saw that question in the chat. It's a really good question. I think my personal view would be we need to sort of focus on those areas where we've got productive soil. So we've got we've used agricultural land classification for some years. There's good reason why we should use our best agricultural land to grow crops, and perhaps those areas where are less productive might be those areas where we do things like grow trees or other mitigation methods. So I would definitely say, yeah, we should focus on a few ecosystem services on those better suited lands. Yeah.
And I think there was a question for you also, Jonathan, about, I guess, really about the policy relating to meat consumption in the UK and whether the NFU is in its modelling, I suppose, preparing for less consumption of meat, or how is that being, over the coming years and decades, how is that being factored in?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that farmers ultimately will follow market trends. If we genuinely saw a massive move away from meat and dairy consumption, then yet clearly the agricultural sector would try to rebalance. But I would remind people, at least in the UK, our country has got more land suited to pasture-based livestock production, which means things like meat and milk, rather than cropping. We can't plough up our hillsides, we can't plough up our uplands. These are very much the sort of lands that are rather poorly suited to growing vegetables and cereals. We must also consider how well we do in terms of meat and dairy production compared with other parts of the world. There may indeed be export opportunities for UK farmers to meet demand outside the UK, even if UK consumption patterns change significantly. I think, though, realistically, it is our job partly to challenge the advice of bodies like the Climate Change Committee and others who say, oh yes, a 30 or 40% cut in meat and dairy consumption is eminently deliverable within a relatively short period of time. Our experience is that these shifts don't happen quite that quickly, and we must be pragmatic and evidence-based.
Okay, John, maybe there's a question I could tackle you with, which is, about your remarks about we don't really know how to do this and we need to get people together to co-create solutions. But I guess the question is, and we talked about it earlier, do we feel that there is a good method that people could be just getting on with now? What's your co-creation going to do to actually move that needle, and will it move in time, given what you also said about, we've only got 10 years and actually we need to be getting on with this?
So my comment was very much directed to delivering impact at scale. I think Ronald gave a very nice account of, yeah, we can absolutely get started. We know what to do to get started. What we can't wait for is by some magic trick for more science to be available that will suddenly reduce all our uncertainties. So we have to work with the best available information we have and update that as new knowledge becomes available. But deliver that, well, there isn't time to go into the details of it, but I don't think we should necessarily follow a single consensus view on how to do it, but we should look at a range of consensus views and evaluate on the basis of that what's the best thing in a given location to be doing on the ground. So my point was very much directed at how do you get big funds, talking about 10 billion a year. It's not a lot of money. To roughly 10 billion a year to put carbon, to restore the world's soils and get carbon out of the atmosphere and get co-benefits relating to climate resilience, working with large financial organizations together with organizations that need to offset, bearing in mind the caveat that soil carbon shouldn't be seen as an excuse for not reducing your own emissions, but there will inevitably be offsets that we require. Soil can't provide more than is absolutely needed anyway. And then working with the organizations that can disseminate the resources and infrastructure that's needed to really accelerate that change.
Okay, and Jonathan, maybe I could move it a little bit. There is a question that says that in an ADAS Sheffield University survey, UK farmers have found not to be adopting multiple soil management practices in a whole farm systems approach. So how do we change this? And do you think that some of the policies that you've been talking about will help encourage that?
Well, I think one of those points, which I hope you're going to pick up in a moment in your summary, is that you've got to be able to incentivize farmers. I don't think we would say that, wouldn't we? Yes, we're the NFU, we're representing farmers. We don't like regulations and sticks as much. We do like carrots. So do try to roll up public goods into farm business models and make it worthwhile farmers adopting these new practices. And then clearly, put in place all the sort of knowledge exchange and advisory services that are required to get the information out there.
Okay, and if I may ask one question, which I don't think has been picked up, but it's just about the newer technologies, the newer tools that you were talking about. I'm interested to know what kind of time scale you think that some of those may be tested within. Because again, we're talking about time running out, we're talking about tools here, we're talking about new approaches, just a frame on that.
Well, look, there's a value judgment here, clearly. There's no point in trying to invest in stuff that's 30 or 40 years away, because it'll be too late by the time it's delivered. What I'm hearing from the biochar people carrying out these field experiments, from Dave Beerling's group at Sheffield doing the enhanced rock weathering and so on, they believe that some of these things could be trialed and turned into nationwide policy programs within about 10 years. So we're talking about, the late 2020s, the early 2030s. To actually start rolling some of that stuff. Now, clearly, there's a great deal of stuff that we can be doing just with conventional soil organic matter in the meantime.
Thank you. I just wanted that in because there was a question about new research priorities. Okay, there is a question here about the elephant in the room, which is the neglect of soils in the strategies for a sustainable future is very worrying. And I think it picks up some of the comments made earlier. How do we address this issue for the developing world? John, would you like to have a stab at that?
Yes, for the developing world. Right. Look, I would say in my long, because I'm very old now, on my long career in soil, working on soils, I've never known soil to be higher up the agenda. So if it's not on your country strategy, it's certainly on the sites of most of the big financial organizations, and for that matter, agricultural companies in the world. Soil is a major focus. And I guess what you're talking about may be political strategies, and in which case policy, well, again, I'm old and cynical enough to wonder whether on a global scale, we can reach consensus to be bold enough, fast enough, which is why I've focused a lot of time talking to the corporate world to see if we can make a business case out of this. But you know, I think if you talk to the right organizations, there is a lot of money ready to go in this direction if governments and other organizations can basically create the right policy environment to make it happen.
Thank you very much. So let's have a look at a couple more questions. There is a specific question about carbon equivalent calculators available to farmers. Are they useful and are they being used? Chris, would you like to go with that, or is that better at Jonathan?
I think it's better at Jonathan. I'm not aware of what.
So are there carbon equivalent calculators available to farmers that are useful, I guess, and are they being used?
Certainly one of the first things that emerged when we started talking to our own members about our net zero ambition is farmers wanted to be able to measure what they're doing. You know, they want to know how good a job am I making at the moment, and if I make these particular changes to farm practice or new investments, you know, how much better could I become? The carbon calculators which are out there at the moment do not all give the same answer. So the general advice is, look, there's, you know, I don't know, we reviewed about 65 of them or something, provided a little bit of advice. We picked 3 or 4 leading ones. There are new ones coming up all the time, or revisions to existing ones to make them better. They won't, you know, you can't swap between them, but what you can do is pick one of those which are recommended by others, you know, look at what you're doing today, look at what you were doing 5 years previously, and then try and run the model for some sort of future scenario where, so if I did all of the following and then put the numbers into the model, what does it say? You know, how much could I improve my carbon footprint? But bearing in mind that carbon footprint, you could either be measuring the carbon footprint of a commodity, a product, a ton of wheat, or you could be measuring the carbon footprint of the whole of your farm business, taking into account all of the opportunities to capture carbon through nature-based solutions, or perhaps indeed to create carbon offsets in other ways.
Thank you very much. I just want to check if there are any other questions that we could try to cover in the time. Okay, just the last one. I think this might be for you, John, briefly, if you may. 60% of farmers are managing 88% of agricultural land. I believe that was your statistic, or if I got that wrong?
Well, it's not my statistic.
Well, I mean, it was
FAO,
it was a statistic that you quoted.
Yep.
How do you want to motivate them to store more stock instead of exploiting the soils for producing food, biomass, etc., to get as much profit as possible? And again, it relates to a question that we heard earlier.
Okay, it's a bit of a loaded question. In industrial scale agriculture, where the people managing the land don't necessarily own it, have a different set of incentives than those that actually own the land. Farmers that own and work the land, on the whole, want to do the best by their soil. The simple fact is the margins are so low that they struggle to do that. So removing mainly the financial barriers to doing that because farms are businesses, right? And people who farm are business people. So creating the right kind of incentives, paying them for the stuff that we're not paying them for just now, but that we depend on, would be a good start.
Thank you. I'm going to ask our previous panel members if they'd like to have one word to just add to any of the questions or discussion that was covered in this thing before I try bravely to sum up, but because I know there was some overlap, and I think it might be interesting if you'd like to have that chance to do it. I will start in running order. Ron, is there anything you would like to add to anything that's been said here, particularly perhaps about some of the political goals, some of the how we incentivize policymakers globally?
Thank you very much again for the opportunity. I think this was a very great event, and all speakers brought nice inputs. Well, my final remark on all this will be that we are really in a critical time, and we are basically in a juncture in which the needs are evident, but also the offer that we are doing in terms of solutions. So I think this is the time to really invest on sustainable soil management and boost soil health. I think we have everything to do so. And the most important thing is that we need to use the available resources that are not only at local level, national governments, etc., but the private sector is willing, and I hope John will materialize that, with the condition that they understand that is not that they have to expect something back in terms of just carbon credits and so. They really need to make their part because they benefit a lot from nature and for everything. So they need to make that commitment. That's a social responsibility.
Thank you. Gideon, would you like to follow with that? There
is so much that I could say after those three really interesting talks in the second half of the session. I'm going to make two comments, if I may, briefly. First is to reiterate my concern I expressed about incentivizing carbon uptake into soil without adequately considering the permanence issue. And one way of making that clear is to think if there was a financial incentive program to farmers which gave them money when carbon increased, would the farmers give the money back when carbon decreased? The farmers are not normally very happy about that idea, but it gives them some tension to the idea that carbon sequestration in soils as a financial offsetting mechanism needs to be treated very carefully indeed.
Thank you.
And the second thing, just very briefly, is to big up UKRI in this space, where I think that they are doing quite a lot of interesting stuff. Chris has talked about some of that. A lot of the work on greenhouse gas removals that Jonathan has talked about is funded by UKRI. And it's extremely useful that that is going on, often in collaboration with government departments towards helping us meet our climate targets. Thank you.
Thank you, Gideon. A very quick one then. Last word, Diana.
Yes, I would just like to emphasize what was said earlier about jumping over the silos. The time is now, we can't afford to wait. And whether it's nations or disciplines, we've all got to get in here and work towards the future fast.
Thank you very much, all of you, for the panel. I will have to try to sum up, but I was just going to ask if our helpers could just share the screens on the Mentimeter, because that might also just reflect a few things, which I thought might be interesting to do. Is that easy to do? Here we go. Whoa, the age of technology. In 3 words or fewer, what do you see as the most pressing challenge with respect to soil science? But you can see it: degradation, biodiversity, pollution, food security, awareness sticking out. Ignorance is in there, carbon sequestration, a very interesting word wall. I think the next one was, if you have any further comments but not questions, please provide them here. There's a wall of comments here. Don't forget, none CO2 emissions from soils. I'm sorry, I can't quite read them all because my view is blocking some of that. Education at various levels. Competing pressures for land are poorly managed at the national scale to optimize benefits. So I think there's some very, very interesting word walls in here. And I wonder if these could be available to people even after the meeting, because I'm conscious that, we are going to run out of time. But it seems to me that the audience, in listening and sharing their thoughts, have also come up with some very interesting things here. This is, what do you see as the best approach to a solution with respect to soil science, climate change, and now here we've got actually quite an even distribution of words, which is, I think, in itself quite interesting, wouldn't you say? So there's a lot of things that have come here. that were mentioned before. Reduce fertilizer, education comes up again, farmer engagement, smallholder farmers, agroforestry comes up, straw management. So a number of people here, more than carbon, well, we've been saying that too, monitoring, collaboration, and non-profit economy. So I think very, very interesting questions, things that the audience, well, the people listening to this have also picked up. Any further comments? One method is to try and address at local community level, local farmers, local research institutes. And the other is too much focus on increasing carbon, not enough on obvious impacts such as compaction, etc., and too much reliance on poor data. So thank you very much. I just wanted to share that because I thought it was it's a sort of thought mood that's going on throughout the meeting. So I don't have very much time left, but I felt it important to hear the panelists who were in the first part because we had such an excellent set of presentations. I'm sure you will agree with me that on the range of topics. And I think what was interesting is that there were definitely some prevailing themes. For example, it's not just about soil carbon, it's more than soil carbon, but it's also not just about soils and their contribution to climate change. Soils are part of the ecosystem. So we need to think about them very much as restoring our ecosystems and the role that they have in that. We started off hearing about a number of tools, approaches, and projects that are going on, but particularly what the potential could be for soils as a way of carbon sequestration and helping us solve climate change. But then that comes with a number of caveats, which are along the side of difficulties of accurately measuring it. And also, as Gideon has pointed out, you can undo it very quickly. So there has to be an understanding about the permanency of any of these measures that we implement in order to approach a better climate change mitigation and as fast as possible. And then on top of that, many of these soil changes will be quite minimal, but there are other surrogates of which are hoping which will help us understand that the direction of travel is moving towards soil health. And we heard, of course, very interesting discussions about the role of soil biodiversity and the fact that actually it's not singled out and should be as something that we consider when we think about the actions we should be taking. And we heard very much some very interesting data on soil biodiversity. And again, one of the bad pieces of news, I think we all know, is agriculture as a practice has degraded our soils. But the good piece of news is that you can recover those by the right kinds of practices. And again, you have this question about permanency though, and you have this question about the fact that soil carbon as a metric, those changes might be relatively slow, they might be relatively modest, but there may be other changes in the soil that are already going to benefit the agricultural system. And we heard, for example, from Chris, his diagram about all the sorts of things that are important, like water retention and many other aspects that are important with respect to climate change. We heard also about some of the challenges, around some of the methods of trying to mitigate and adapt. And Gideon covered some of those in the UK context, but I believe many of them have relevance globally. But we also heard from Jonathan about some of the policy areas that are incentivizing farmers to do the right practices. And there are challenges how you reach not just the smallholder farmers, but actually how you reach into the policies of developing countries and really help them understand the importance of soil as an asset to them. It's one of their most important assets, and they need to rethink and give that soil carbon and soil health greater priority, not just high levels of productivity and so on. But linked to all of that, we also had a stark reminder from John and others indeed that, as John said, farmers are businesses, they need to be viable business. So economics for them is going to be important. We can't expect them to implement challenges that puts them out of business. So understanding that whole context of what we're expecting to do and trying to incentivize them with a form of reward that links to the positive practices is one of the biggest challenges facing us. So I was quite concerned to hear from John's initial study and that report he mentioned that they didn't see an easy answer to that. And I feel that there surely needs to be a coming together of the financial sector and understanding how we can help, how they can help. And Ron picked that up at the end, and as a call to arms in a way. We all need to get together now to move this needle in the direction that we need it to move in order to save the future for the generations, our generation, and the generations that are going to follow us. And we need to act very, very fast. So in a nutshell, fascinating set of presentations. I have not done justice to it in my very brief summary, but I do want to thank all our speakers for sticking on time, for covering the aspects they did, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you very much.